Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are reviewing the one and only early novel, Don Quixote by Cervantes, which is, of course, the two-part novel and one of the, earliest versions of the novel that we can really claim to be a proper novel. Part 1 and Part 2 were written separately, which is a very good thing to note because a lot of this review that you're watching now is going to be about the dichotomy between those two and about how I reacted to Part 1 versus Part 2. They were written separately about 10 years apart or something like that, so that's why I note that. Because in the end, Don Quixote was a very interesting experience. I had very surprising reactions to both parts, I shall say. I spent the last couple of months reading this book. I read Part 1 in August, then had a couple weeks off while I was finishing reading a Wheel of Time book, and then I read all of Part 2 in September. So, just as there was a gap in the writing of them, I took a small gap in the reading of them to give that a little bit of zest in the reading experience, we shall say. Either way, I finally got to take this book off of my pile of shame over the last couple months reading it because I had missed it for a read-along like a couple years ago. I don't remember when it was specifically, but was definitely on my pile of shame for a while. I'm very glad that I got to take it off and had quite, like I said, the varying experience that I was pretty surprised by. So let's talk about all of that. Let's jump into it with the good of Don Quixote, and I have a few points which are Part 1 specific, some that are Part 2 specific, and then some that are a little bit broader across the entire book. So for Part 1, definitely the things that I liked the most about Part 1 were the dramatic side stories. Whenever you hear about Don Quixote, you kind of hear about how this is like a satire, how it's a little bit more amusing, it's a funny story, it's very much a take of, well, you have a lot of iconic scenes, even in Part 1, where you just have amusing things happening that are like pretty absurd. It's kind of an absurd type of humor in there. But Part 1 really surprised me with its dramatic side stories. There are various other characters that you meet there, and characters that are trying to influence the direction of the story to a degree where all those characters are just really, really good. Those characters will tell their own backstory over the course of a few chapters. The convalescence of those side stories all culminating together throughout Part 1 is also something that was just really satisfying because I was invested in those side stories a little bit more than I was in the main characters. Everything that was just a little bit more dramatic and semi-serious about Part 1 is what I found so engaging about that. And then Part 2, some of the things that I liked a lot about Part 2 specifically was the tone of it. Part 2 definitely focuses a little bit more on the humor than Part 1 does, and it really succeeded on that front in large part because of the meta aspect of it, the way that it lets it fit into the broader narrative, the way that it utilizes the framing device and the meta nature of it. Part 2 is just really great. It's awesome because of that. It incorporated Part 1 into the book as kind of its own in-world book. That's the meta aspect of it. That's part of the meta aspect of it anyway, and I really appreciated that actually. Turned out making for several great sequences. Most of my favorite parts of Part 2 are because Part 1 of the book exists in the world of Part 2. It's really great. You also get to see a little bit of inclusion of like the very real life apocryphal sequel to Don Quixote that was a thing and also gets referenced as a meta thing within Part 2. So like just in general, the meta is very cool. And like I said before, the humor and tone of Part 2 definitely worked for me a lot. There's maybe only like 50 pages max out of the 500 pages of Part 2 that I was not super into. And even some of that was still fine. Out of 500, like I said, only like 10% not really being a slam dunk is not a slight in the slightest. It is great. As for the entire book as a whole, I've got to say the prose and the translation of this was really good to read, very appropriate for the tone. It conveyed what I feel like was the tone of Don Quixote without being obtuse, because part of the thing about like the introduction of this that I read from the translation side of it anyway, is that there are a lot of Don Quixote translations, and many of them are not great, and many of the earlier ones specifically try to age the the English of it in the translation, not just because they're older translations, but also like inherently trying to make them sound a little bit older. You know, a lot of them will translate like you into thee, or any of that kind of like, you know, King James style, like biblical type of stuff. And that, I feel like for this book, it could work, but it would take a very deft hand to actually do that successfully. So not bothering that with that, but also still managing to make the tone of the story work. I really respect the ability to do that. It was great. And then also, just as a matter of reading this book, it was very fast. It's about 1,000 pages to actually read, but it did not take me that long as I would expect a book of this length to take me. Part 1 of this book, I think, barely took me 20 hours to read, and part 2 only took me like maybe a little over 20 hours, like maximum 25. So in grand total, I think I only spent about 45 hours on Don Quixote, where at my reading speed with most other things, I would have expected for this to take me probably closer to 60 hours. So relatively speaking, it is actually a pretty quick read, at least with the Rutherford translation for me. So that one is pretty cool. But definitely another a little bit more on the lines of kind of what I was saying with part 1. Something that I appreciate about the whole book is that like the companions in antics of the book, they're all pretty great. You know, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza can sometimes be a little bit too much, but all the other side characters are really great. Their inclusions, the moments that they exist, are all really engaging. You have those dramatic side characters and stories, like I said in part 1, that are really good. You have very specific side characters like Sansón and the Duke and Duchess in part 2, other participants in part 2, generally speaking, that just allow for the shenanigans that get up to like really fun, as opposed to being irritating. So that's something that I really have to commend the book for. But mentioning irritating and that kind of aspect of Don Quixote, let's talk a little bit about the bad here. And that is that, you know, part 1 in specific is like basically the only section where like I have notable critiques, like as far as part 1 versus part 2, because the humor of part 1 really missed for me as a whole. That is because Don Quixote and Sancho Panza got really aggravating because a lot of their antics felt a little bit too real. They were in a world of people that were like, they were actually disturbing the peace. You know, they're ruining some people's lives in some ways, you know, and that's not very funny. So I didn't find it very funny in part 1. The antics really upending everything just bothered me, as opposed to part 2, where the relative meta aspect of part 1 being a book within the book for part 2 means that some characters know who these characters are now, and some of those characters, like the Duke and Duchess, actually organize a lot of the shenanigans that go on to kind of make those amusing things happen. And because everybody's in on the joke, it is actually amusing. Whereas, like I said in part 1, you're actually like kind of upending a lot of things about certain people's lives, and that's not great. You know, when it's the innkeeper and his family getting basically terrorized, like that's annoying actually, as opposed to funny. Anyway, some other things about the book. Ironically, the dramatic side story, like the one time there's a dramatic side story that happens somewhat near-ish the end of part 2, that actually didn't work because part 2 was doing the humor so well, whereas part 1 was doing the dramatic side story stuff quite well, but not the humor. So, you know, that was just kind of funny. Don Quixote is also quite long. Like I said, this thing is like 1,000 pages. And as far as like what actually happens, you know, plot wise, well, you know, some people just aren't really going to like what this book is doing because it's not really plotted basically at all. It's a version of slice of life. Like it's a very early type of slice of life, except that life is just the very absurd antics of a crazy person and his questionably crazy sidekick. You're just following the characters along with this crazy and amusing journey. That's basically what's going on. Like I said, there is no real plot, even though there are some things that do come together in the end, especially at the end of part 2, but, you know, there's not really a plot to follow. So if that's something you're looking for, even in your classics, Don Quixote is not the choice for you. Definitely not a plot-focused book. Another bad thing is just the fact that parts 1 and 2 are very different, you know? You can't really judge one based off of the other. If you don't enjoy part one very much, maybe that's because some of the humor aspects aren't landing. You should probably still read part two, for example, because part two is legitimately super amusing, and for me, made part one worth reading alone. If you really, really like part one for the dramatic side stories, and the humor just straight up doesn't click for you at all, part two might not be good at all just because it's not doing what you want from the book. If you're expecting for the two parts to be different and have slightly different focuses, this might be fine. But because they are so different, so sort of different, because it's not even like they're that different, it's just the execution of things is different. But either way, the differences between them makes it, you know, a little bit harder to like feel like they're, I don't know, they feel like they're the same book, but they execute things differently is what I'm trying to say here. Yeah, and then this is a little bit more of a personal point, especially with regards to the Rutherford translation here. That is that the end notes are pretty unhelpful. Just broad scale, I feel like about a sixth of these end notes were actually good or useful. Then there were like 2/3 of these end notes that were, you know, technically useful, decent, but for me were like already known or potential to be known. Like if you've read the thing that's being referenced, you don't need the end note at all. And then there are also plenty of cases like the other half of the end notes, which are just straight up unhelpful because what in the world is this thing telling me? There are plenty of cases where, you know, even if you've read what's being referenced, you get the endnote, but if you have not read what's being referenced, the endnote doesn't actually explain anything to make it understandable. So you're just like, why? What did that just mean? But there are also plenty of just straight up unhelpful endnotes that are like, what does this even mean? Like where it's not even referencing anything specific, but where the information it gives you is like, huh? You know, that kind of thing. There are, and on top of all that, there are also plenty of moments where it's like, well, if you're end noting these things here, there are some of these things that should be end noted because I have no idea what in the world is being referenced here. So yeah, like just the general state of end notes, at least with the Rutherford translation, not fantastic, unfortunately, which for a book like this is unhelpful. The ugly is kind of continuing along a similar note, and that is the fact that Don Quixote, I don't feel like has as much impact as I feel like it should have, or as it definitely could have, if I had read a little bit more of what it's kind of based on, what it is satirizing. So namely a lot of other chivalric tales. I feel like I personally missed a lot because of these, and exacerbated by the unhelpful endnotes, it just wasn't really enough for me to really get some of the things. You know, a lot of the references that are like, well, I know that's referencing something, but I have no idea what. Just wish I knew a little bit more about some of that stuff. There's also like Orlando Furioso in particular is referenced a lot, and I feel like I probably should have read that before I had ever read Don Quixote, because I probably would have found at least a little bit more joy in those references, kind of like the way that I did with like Homer and some of the Bible references. But again, that even goes back to that same point. Even like the Homer and Bible references, if you've read either of those things, or if you've read Homer, or you're in any way steeped in Christian mythos at all, like you don't need any of those endnotes because a lot of them are just kind of common knowledge. Maybe just common knowledge for me. I don't know. Maybe this is partially a personal issue, but like, anyway, that's just how I feel about those things. Let's talk about the recommendation of Don Quixote, and really it comes down to what you are looking for and what you're expecting Don Quixote to be. If you're wanting amusing antics of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza as promised, part 2 is absolutely worth reading, and therefore worth reading part 1 for. I genuinely think part 2 is enjoyable enough to justify reading part 1, for example. But I would also say maybe don't expect the humor to be quite as much about what part 1 is about, because it does other things a little bit better. I have some friends who told me that the side stories were what they mostly enjoyed about part 1 as well. So, you know, there's that. It's kind of hard to say. Depends on what you're expecting, and also if you are going to read this, expect for part 1 to not succeed on the humor as much as the side stuff, and then expect for part 2 to be a little bit more on the humor. Specifically, know that they are a little bit different. Maybe give yourself a small break in between reading the 2 parts, so that difference in tonal execution, I guess, so that doesn't bother you. Because as far as like a recommendation, I don't think Don Quixote is a must read. You know, it's kind of one of those zeitgeist things where like maybe you should read it just so you know, but otherwise it's like, I don't know. If you're interested in Don Quixote, give it a shot for sure. Just know what you're getting into. But if you're not really interested in reading Don Quixote, you don't need to go out of your way to read it. That's basically how I feel about it. And there you have it. That is the review for Don Quixote. I hope that I did a good job with this one. I feel like it was a pretty rough review, but be sure to let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this review. Either way, if you did, I really appreciate it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.